today's video, we're going to talk about wood movement, the bane of many woodworkers' existence. We're going to talk a little bit about what it is, why it happens, and how we can try and deal with it. Now, the first thing we have to understand here is why it moves. Well, obviously when a tree is alive, it's full of water, it's full of liquid, it's helping it survive, it's helping it grow. When we cut the tree down and we start cutting it up, there's still moisture in there. That's fine, we dry it out. Now, unfortunately though, wood, even when it's dead, still holds some level of water. There are ways to get a lot of that out of there, but it's more rare. So we have to deal with the ability for water to transfer in and out of the wood, even when it's long dead and dry. Fortunately, most places are pretty good at drying wood, so you can get it down to a level 10, 7, 9, 13%. This is going to depend upon your area, as every area has kind of a relative moisture content that's specific to that region, that area. Now that changes throughout the year depending upon the season, sometimes more wildly in certain places than other places. The moisture content is what affects whether the wood moves or doesn't. Places like Florida are much more humid. The relative humidity is higher, the air moisture content is higher. That doesn't mean though that wood is necessarily going to move more there, because we can stabilize to an extent our wood to our area by letting it acclimate, but that doesn't really stabilize against changes throughout the year. Somewhere like the Midwest, where I am, has these wild swings, which gets a little bit trickier in terms of how much it moves throughout the year. Now, one of the biggest issues with wood movement is how the board is cut. Movement generally happens, at least as far as we're concerned, when building along the grain lines. Now, most wood we buy is flat sawn, meaning that it's kind of across and flat in general. It may just be half of that if you're buying a certain part of a board, but generally it goes across, and wood wants to expand across the grain. We can obviously get it cut quarter sawn where the grain goes up and down like this, and it leads to a little more expansion this way, though less, and not as much this way. It's a desired wood in many cases for building certain things, but it's not cut often that way other than a few species like white oak, because it limits how much you can get out of the log. When you're quarter sawing, you can't take these giant slices across the log. So to increase the yield, most places do not naturally quarter saw most types of wood. So when it comes to the wood we generally work with, we've got our flat sawn. Okay, fine, we know it's going to move, but how do we figure out how much it's going to move? I'm going to assume that your wood was properly dried from the supplier, kiln, or air dried. You can't really do much if it's not properly dried in the first place. Whatever you do is not going to help that other than letting it dry longer. For my area, let's say 10% is the kind of stabilized amount we want. Great, that's perfectly fine. However, moisture changes, air moisture content changes throughout the year. 5% here, 6% here, and a total swing between winter and summer can be 10, 12%, something like that. Every species, scientists have kind of figured out what percentage change there is in the wood. And the key here is a percentage. It's not a set amount. It all depends on how wide your initial starting piece is. And this is where we can get into some trouble. If we have, for say, a 9-inch piece of soft maple here, flat sawn, very, very flat sawn, we're looking at, in the end, after doing the math, about an 1/8 of an inch change for every 6% change in moisture. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually quite a bit. A whole 1/8 of a percent for every 6% change in moisture, or an 1/8 of an inch, I should say. And that's absolutely going to happen between winter and summer. That is a reasonable amount to expect in my area. So let's say it's currently winter, right? It's quite dry out. Let's just call this 9 inches. Okay, it's got stabilized to this time of the year at this relative humidity moisture level. Well, it's obviously going to be at about its most contracted point. So I know that in the summer I can expect somewhere around of an 1/8 of an inch wider to have to deal with that. Now there are charts online for all of the species. Calculating moisture content in the air is a little tricky, but relative humidity is a good way to look at the change. It's not exactly the air moisture percentage, but it's close. You can kind of look at that and know if you're having a big change or not. So let me give you an example of where this would impact me. I like to make a lot of boxes, and I like to put solid wood lids and bases in them. Now let's say I was going to use this curly maple for the base. I like to set my bases inside of a groove. I don't just connect them to the bottom. I know my measuring point starting out, right? And if I'm building in the summer, I know I'm kind of closer to the higher end. But if I'm building in the winter, I know that I have to give enough room for an 1/8 of an inch expansion across the width. We generally don't have to worry a ton about across the length, and wood does move a little bit across the thickness, but it's relatively minor as a percentage compared to when we're dealing with a wide board to start. Most of the time we don't have 9-inch thick pieces of quarter sawn wood that we have to worry about like that. So within that groove, I'm not going to fit it perfectly to this. I'm going to leave 3/30 seconds on either side. I'm going to buy myself a little bit of room in case it's more than an 1/8 of an inch, but I shouldn't have to expect a whole lot of that. So I'm going to add, 3/16 extra on top of the width of this, split evenly generally into the groove that I'm making the base out of. I've never had a bottom split. That's always worked for me. I can't guarantee it'll work for you, but it's always worked for me as long as I leave that room in there. The same goes for the lid. And I've actually had problems with this. I like to make sliding lid boxes. I don't have to deal with hinges, the cost of hinges. I have had lids that I've, especially early on, built in the winter, and I sell a lot of my boxes. When I would go in the summer to take one out to pack it up to ship, there have been times where I could quite literally not get the lid out of there. I had to wrap a towel around it, have somebody else hold the box while I'm just yanking on this thing. I didn't think about it back then. I didn't know enough about wood movement to expect that. So what I do now is I obviously take into account when I'm building this, and I leave a little extra room on either side to account for that. Now that means it's a little sloppier in the winter when it's drier. It's a little bit looser. My shop is outdoors. If this was an indoor climate controlled shop and I knew this was always going to be an inside box, I could probably make it a little bit tighter. Climate control has helped stabilize humidity to an extent, but the box is still getting shipped somewhere. It could spend 5 days in essentially outside, airplanes, all of that, where it has to experience that. And I don't want the box to arrive to the customer and they can't get the lid out because it's the dead of summer. It's been on an airplane, it's been sitting outside somewhere, wherever, and they can't get it out. It's going to be hard to explain. You got to wait a few days for the moisture content to change, and then you can open up the expensive box you've just bought. That's going to be hard to do. So now I always make sure that my lids are a little slippy, little sloppy if it's in the winter, so that I know when the summer comes, I won't have any issues with that. Now let's talk about a few other ways we can deal with wood movement. A lot of times when we're doing joinery, we're essentially trapping pieces of wood inside another. Think of a mortise and tenon, right? It's trapped in there. Now on large scales, we create loose joinery, but on most small scales, 4 inches, 3 inches, 2 inches, something like that, we go back to that percentage. And if you're looking at a very small percentage, 0.0025, let's call it that, multiplied by the thickness or the width of the wood and then the moisture content change, it's going to give us such a tiny number that the amount of force created by that is not going to crack anything. That's why we can glue and pin a mortise and tenon in place on like a chair, and we don't have to worry about it on a stool, whatever. We can affix that in there because that change over time is just quite tiny and not enough to blow through the sides of that. But what about when we get something very wide? Let's say we have a table. Well, we have to do some kind of pinning or floating, I like to call it. And usually when you want to pin a board, you want to pin it in the center or on one side. Wood obviously wants to expand this way, but we can control that a little bit. We can pick a point where we want to affix, and then we can let it freely move outside or in one direction. And a few key things to think about this are breadboard ends. We pin the middle with glue. That middle point holding on the breadboard end is fixed. It's glued, it's not moving. But on the outside, we have 2 pins that can move through slots a little bit. And if you've ever seen a wide breadboard end table, in the summer, you can see it generally kind of meeting the breadboard ends or a little bit expanded over them if you got, your measurements wrong. But in the winter, you'll notice there's a gap. There's a gap on either side, usually because we've pinned in the middle, and it can now expand and contract roughly evenly on either side, and it works out great. It's a brilliant design. Whoever did it, absolutely brilliant. Let's think about another example though, where we would just pin from one end. Let's imagine this is the side of a box, a drawer, something like that. We've got the wood grain going this way, so we can expect expansion going back and forth. If you have all 4 sides and it's equal thickness, ideally from the same type of wood, it will expand and contract roughly evenly. But we want to attach possibly, let's say, some kind of drawer runner on the side, maybe a dovetail slide, something like that, a little, fanciness. We're going to be sticking it across here, right? This is going to be a problem. We're going to be trapping this wood. Well, what can we do about that? Well, we can pin it on one side only. And by pin, I mean either apply glue or an actual dowel pin. And if our groove is relatively tight that it's sitting in, it's not going to move. So we would say glue it on the front here so that it can't be pulled out. And this would allow this back area here to free float so that this wood, while pinned in this area right here, can still expand and contract along this way. I just in general like to think of pinning and floating as your two ways to get around wood movement. You either pin something in a specific spot, either one side or the dead center, or you allow something to float. And like I said before, you really only have to worry about this when you start getting over 4, 5, 5 is kind of borderline inches there, 4 inches and under, and you're usually pretty good. You're usually at that point such a small percentage change that it's not going to impact your work. Another thing I want to touch on is using man-made substrates and veneer, whether you buy it or you make your own. I love toying around with making my own. These obviously don't expand and contract MDF plywood at anywhere near the same rate as solid wood, which is great because we can get it in huge sheets and cover huge areas with a single piece. And we don't have to worry about that veneer having the pulling power of a solid piece of wood. Obviously, the biggest reason is cost savings. It gets very expensive to build. Let's say you're building a cabinet or something. You want to have a hardwood top, solid wood, but you want to have sides that match. Well, there's no real reason to use solid wood on the sides if you don't, just have money just falling out of the sky for you. Get a piece of MDF, veneer over it, and now you don't have to worry about the sides dealing with expansion and contraction. You only have to deal with the top, which gets much easier to use a pinning technique from underneath to allow that to expand and contract. You don't have to deal with the side at all. Obviously, veneering over large pieces gets a little tricky. You may need a veneering, what do they call it, vacuum bag, something like that. But at the cost, it's going to be cheaper than buying solid wood for giant pieces, especially if you're using some kind of nice figured wood. I've also seen people who make large chests or large boxes take MDF, veneer both sides, and then they will just use that as their lid instead, saving money, obviously, not dealing with expansion and contraction, and having the same look in the end as using an expensive piece of hardwood. And in many cases, you can find the ultimate figured pieces in veneer. Sometimes they just take the best stuff, they just veneer it because there's just a lot more of it in terms of visual quantity when you can expand it over a piece of MDF or something like that. So play around with making your own veneers if you have a bandsaw. I like doing it. I only go down to about a 32nd of an inch. I find it gets real flimsy after that. It's obviously different if you're getting it sliced from the shop. You don't have to deal with any bandsaw kind of tooth marks, anything like that, cleaning it up. But it can be a great way to save money and a great way to not have to deal with expansion and contraction. Our other main option is torrified wood. When it's been kiln heated in it's in a vacuum essentially, no air. It's heated up to a point where it would otherwise burn the wood. But we've removed all the oxygen so there's no fuel in there to burn. It dries it out incredibly and it removes most of the organic material in there, the lignin and stuff like that, that would hold water. This is not going to expand much, and if you drop some water on this, it doesn't really sink in at all. Not the cheapest wood and not something that's super easy to find other than a few species, and otherwise not the greatest to work with. It's a little problematic to work with, and you obviously get stuck with this very dark color if you don't like that, so it's very limiting. You're not going to want to build every project out of a torrified wood, even if, though, for some projects, it's really cool looking. You can often find white oak quarter sawn, mainly though for the aesthetic of those medullary rays, which I'm sure all of us have tried to sand out at one point very early on, thinking that they were saw marks. That's a common quarter sawn. You can get quarter sawn maple, and if you look hard enough, you can find a few boards of most things quarter sawn, but most lumber yards do not carry a ton of quarter sawn version of everything. It's just not the best way to get the yield. Like I mentioned earlier, they're gonna make less money unless they charge way more per piece. I wanted to show one example here of kind of the drying and splitting. This was from the elm I milled as well. This was from a larger crotch section, and I borrowed some pieces of this for something else. But we can see these big cracks along here. And even though I sealed the ends with a lot of wax, this still had so much moisture in it, and it's been sitting in my shed that I got some cracking, especially along this crotch area. And then this area was near the pith, the center of the tree, which is just so prone to cracking in general. But this is wood movement. It wanted to move and it split itself apart. That's unfortunate. Fortunately, it hasn't gone to the other side, so I can probably split this down the middle and still get this top piece, though I do lose some of this beautiful crotch figure. In general, though, that's why when you buy rough sawn lumber, you'll often see the ends that are painted over with a latex paint. It's to keep the moisture from flying out the end grain, causing cracking, and to let it just kind of go in and out of the top and bottom. Speaking of the top and bottom, another thing we can do is when we go to finish wood, we can finish each side evenly. I know it's unfortunate that that means you then have to use twice as much finish, and sometimes it's awkward to finish the underside of something or the inside of something. But finish is not going to keep moisture in and out, but we want it to leave evenly. That'll especially help with cupping as well. So if you're applying polyurethane to the top, you should at least apply 2/3 of that amount to the bottom as well. Maybe not 100% of the same amount, but you want enough on the bottom that it's going to allow a similar amount of moisture leaving from the top and bottom so you don't get cupping, or at least you don't get as worse of cupping, and you don't get any major cracking related to moisture trying to find a place to escape that's very specific. I want to show you a real-world example of expansion and contraction. This is a cabinet for drawers I keep under my bench, and this is a solid piece or a solid panel of pine all the way across here, about 1/4 inch thick. I built this in the summer and it was fit perfectly to this groove, and you can see the giant gaps now as we've contracted in the winter on either side. Now fortunately I've kept this from splitting because I only pinned it top and bottom with a screw on each of those, and that held it entirely in there. I don't have to worry about it cracking, and I was able to use solid wood, just some construction lumber, to make this giant panel. If I had glued this in there, it would absolutely, almost certainly have cracked, but fortunately I was thinking ahead. So think about that when you're making wide panels. If you can just pin them, it works out perfectly. In the end, wood movement is something we all have to deal with. It's just a fact of woodworking. There are obviously some ways we can try to minimize this, but the takeaway here, what I really want you to think about here is pinning and floating are two ways to help combat cracking or any big issues coming from movement, and that whenever you're using a wider piece, you have to expect more expansion because it's a percentage. So you're going to get a larger individual amount because of the percentage across a wider board. So if you're normal small joinery, not the biggest problem. But when you start getting into 10, well, even 9 inches in the case of the maple, we're looking at 1/8 of an inch there, which can be a lot. All right, hopefully that's helped you a bit. I didn't want to go too deep into a bunch of science here today. All right, have a good one.